In a bustling city park on Veterans Day, an outspoken black feminist activist, Naomi Simmons, takes the stage to rally a crowd. Amidst her passionate speech, she locks eyes with a quiet, elderly veteran, Major Henry Calloway, adorned with medals. Her fiery rhetoric takes an unexpected turn, challenging his pride in symbols of war. The crowd gasps, but what follows is a story of confrontation, reflection, and unexpected lessons that will leave you questioning everything you thought you knew. Naomi Simmons stood at the center of the park, her voice ringing out through the speakers as a crowd of onlookers gathered. It was Veterans Day, a time meant to honor those who had served. But Naomi had a different agenda. A self-proclaimed black feminist and activist, she was known for her impassioned speeches and unfiltered opinions. Today, she was determined to shed light on the systemic injustices she believed were rooted in the nation's history. Every year, we are told to honor those who fought in wars. We are told to respect the symbols of violence as if they represent freedom, Naomi declared, her words sharp and deliberate. But whose freedom are we talking about? Whose lives were sacrificed, and for what purpose? Are we really celebrating peace, or are we glorifying destruction? The crowd was a mix of supporters, skeptics, and casual passers-by. Some nodded in agreement, while others shifted uncomfortably. Among them was Major Henry Calloway, an elderly veteran seated on a park bench near the stage. Dressed in his military uniform, his chest adorned with medals, Henry watched Naomi with a calm, unreadable expression. Naomi's eyes locked onto Henry, and her voice faltered. The sight of the medals seemed to ignite a fire within her. She pointed toward him, her voice rising. "There he is, a perfect example of what I'm talking about, dressed in medals like they're badges of honor, while the truth of war is buried beneath propaganda." The crowd gasped. Some turned to look at Henry, who remained seated, his hands resting on a cane. Naomi stepped closer to the edge of the stage, her voice dripping with conviction. "Tell me, sir, how many lives were destroyed for those medals? How many families were torn apart? How many innocent people paid the price for your so-called valor?" Henry's eyes met hers, his gaze steady but somber. He did not respond, nor did he flinch under the weight of her accusations. His silence only seemed to embolden Naomi further. "You see, this is the problem. We are taught to respect symbols without questioning their meaning. We are told to honor sacrifices without asking who benefited. This is why we must challenge these narratives." A man in the crowd shouted, "He's a hero. Show some respect." Others murmured in agreement, but Naomi held her ground. "Respect is earned, not demanded. And I'm not here to sugarcoat the truth. If you think I'm wrong, then prove me wrong." Henry slowly rose from his bench, the movement deliberate and measured. The crowd fell silent, all eyes on the elderly man. He adjusted his uniform and took a step forward, leaning on his cane. "Young lady," he began, his voice calm but firm, "you don't know my story." The tension in the air was palpable as Henry's words hung in the silence. Naomi crossed her arms. "Then tell us," she challenged. "Enlighten us if you think your story justifies glorifying war." Henry took another step, his gaze sweeping across the crowd. "War is not glorious," he said quietly, yet his words carried the weight of years of experience. "These medals are not trophies. They are reminders. Each one represents a moment of sacrifice, a life lost, a burden carried." The crowd leaned in, captivated by his measured tone. Henry continued, "I don't wear these medals to boast. I wear them to remember the friends I lost, the lives I couldn't save, and the sacrifices that were made for the chance of peace." Naomi's expression faltered, her confidence waning. "But at what cost?" she pressed. "How can you justify the destruction, the pain, the suffering?" Henry nodded, his face etched with pain. "There is no justification for the horrors of war, but sometimes the fight is not about glory or power. Sometimes it's about protecting the innocent, about standing against tyranny, about doing what must be done, even when it breaks your soul. The crowd was silent, the weight of Henry's words sinking in. Naomi stared at him, her mind racing. She had expected anger or defiance, but what she saw in Henry was something else entirely: regret, sorrow, and unshakable resolve. Henry took a deep breath, his voice softening. "I don't expect you to understand, and I don't blame you for questioning. In fact, I respect your courage to speak out. But before you judge, take the time to learn, to listen, because the truth is never simple." Naomi opened her mouth to respond, but found herself at a loss for words. The crowd began to murmur, the spell of silence broken. Some clapped for Henry, while others looked at Naomi with newfound skepticism. As Henry turned to leave, Naomi called out to him. "Wait." He paused, looking back. "I want to know your story," she said, her voice softer now. "All of it." Henry studied her for a moment before nodding. "Then I'll tell it. But only if you're willing to listen." The crowd dispersed slowly, the tension lingering in the air. Naomi stood on the stage, her mind swirling with thoughts. She had come to challenge a system, but in the process, she had been challenged herself, and deep down, she knew this was only the beginning. The next morning, Naomi Simmons sat in her small apartment, staring at her laptop screen. Major Henry Calloway's words from the park replayed in her mind, challenging everything she thought she knew. The confrontation had left her shaken, and as she analyzed the moment again, doubt crept in, a foreign feeling for someone so sure of her convictions. Naomi was not used to doubting herself. Her voice had always been her weapon, cutting through injustice with unwavering precision. Yet now, the sharpness had dulled. She had spoken her truth with passion, but Major Calloway's measured words had introduced an unsettling complexity she couldn't ignore. Her phone buzzed, interrupting her thoughts. A text from Leah, her closest friend, appeared. "Your speech is trending. Mixed reactions. Call me." Naomi sighed and clicked the link Leah had sent. A video of her clash with Calloway had gone viral, amassing thousands of comments. Many praised her courage for confronting difficult truths, but just as many criticized her for what they saw as an unfair attack on a veteran. One comment struck a nerve. "Naomi, I admire your passion, but sometimes you need to listen first. Justice begins with understanding." The words lingered in her mind, gnawing at her confidence. Had she really been so intent on making her point that she missed something crucial? Determined to reconcile her unease, Naomi began researching Major Calloway. What she discovered surprised her. Henry Calloway wasn't just any veteran. He had fought tirelessly for the inclusion of black soldiers during a time of segregation. Articles detailed how he challenged discriminatory policies, risking his career to advocate for equality. He had earned his medals not just on the battlefield, but in the fight for justice within the military. The more she read, the more her perception shifted. Naomi felt guilt claw at her as she recalled mocking his medals in front of the crowd. They weren't symbols of glorified violence. They were markers of sacrifice, resilience, and the lives of those he'd served alongside. These were not simple tokens, but profound reminders of human stories, of struggles that transcended ideologies. By mid-afternoon, Naomi made a decision. She needed to speak with him, not as an activist challenging a symbol, but as a person seeking understanding. She called Leah. "Do you know where the local Veterans Center is?" Leah hesitated. "Why? Are you planning something?" "No," Naomi said firmly. "I need to apologize, and to listen." Later that day, Naomi stood outside the Veterans Center, a modest brick building with a plaque that read, "Dedicated to those who served." She hesitated, heart pounding before stepping inside. The scent of coffee and polished wood filled the air. A receptionist looked up with a warm smile. "Can I help you?" "I'm looking for Major Henry Calloway," Naomi said. The receptionist nodded. He's in the back, helping with the food drive. You can go on in." Naomi followed the sound of quiet conversation to a small kitchen. Several veterans were packing boxes of canned goods, and at the center of the activity stood Henry, dressed in a simple sweater. His demeanor was relaxed and warm, a stark contrast to the solemn figure she had confronted. One of the men noticed Naomi lingering at the doorway. "Henry, you've got a visitor," he called. Henry turned, his smile fading as he recognized her. "Ms. Simmons," he said evenly. "What brings you here?" Naomi stepped forward, hands clasped nervously. "I came to apologize," she said. "I was wrong to attack you without understanding your story." Henry studied her, his expression unreadable. "Apology accepted," he said finally. "But what made you change your mind?" "I read about you," Naomi admitted. "About your service, the work you did for black soldiers and the risks you took. I realized I had judged you unfairly. That's not the kind of person or activist I want to be." Henry gestured for her to sit. "It takes courage to admit when you're wrong," he said. "What do you want to know?" Naomi hesitated. "Why do you wear the medals? If they remind you of so much pain, why not leave them behind?" Henry's expression softened. "Because forgetting would be a betrayal. These medals aren't just symbols, they're stories. They represent people I cared about, who gave everything for what they believed in. I wear them to honor their memory, not to glorify war." As Henry spoke, Naomi listened closely, her assumptions unraveling. He shared stories of comrades who had stood by him in battle, of moments of hope and despair, and of returning to a country that still viewed him as less than equal despite his sacrifices. He described the deep, painful contradictions of loving a nation that had not always loved him back. By the time he finished, Naomi felt a profound sense of humility. "Thank you for sharing this with me," she said. "I still have so much to learn, but I want to do better, not just as an activist, but as a person." Henry smiled. "That's all any of us can do. Try to be better. And for what it's worth, I think your passion has the power to make a difference. Just don't lose sight of the people you're speaking for, or against." As Naomi left the center, she felt a weight lift from her shoulders. She hadn't just apologized. She had started a journey of understanding. For the first time in a long while, she felt like she was truly on the right path. The days following her meeting with Major Henry Calloway were transformative for Naomi Simmons. She found herself reflecting on his words and her own approach to activism. Her conversation with Henry had stirred something deep within, a need to reconcile her fiery passion with empathy and understanding. For the first time in years, she felt compelled to slow down, to listen more than she spoke, and to see the humanity behind the causes she championed. Naomi spent hours researching the experiences of veterans, particularly those who shared Henry's struggles as black soldiers in a segregated military. She learned about the Tuskegee Airmen, the first African-American military pilots, and the Montford Point Marines, who endured racism even as they fought for freedom. She read about individual soldiers whose sacrifices went unrecognized for decades, their stories hidden in the shadows of history. Each account was a reminder of the resilience required to serve a country that had often refused to see them as equals. As her understanding grew, so did her regret. She thought about the park crowd and how her words might have alienated people who had come to hear her message. She didn't regret speaking out against systemic injustice. She never would. But her approach had been flawed. By targeting Henry without knowing his story, she risked undermining the very principles she stood for. Determined to make amends, Naomi decided to organize a new event. This time, she wanted a dialogue, not a monologue. She reached out to community leaders, veterans groups, and activists, inviting them to join her in a public conversation about service, sacrifice, and the intersections of race, history, and justice. When Naomi called Henry to invite him, she was nervous. "Major Calloway," she began, "I'm organizing an event, and I'd be honored if you would join me as a speaker. Your perspective could help bridge some of the divides in our community." Henry was quiet for a moment. "Miss Simmons, why me? Plenty of others could speak just as well, if not better." "Because your story changed me," Naomi admitted. "You taught me understanding isn't about agreeing on everything. It's about listening. I want others to hear your story the way I did." Henry's tone softened. "All right, I'll do it. But only if you promise this isn't about smoothing things over. Real dialogue is messy and doesn't always lead to neat conclusions." "I wouldn't expect anything less," Naomi replied. The event was held in a community center, its modest auditorium packed with people from all walks of life. The stage was set with 2 chairs and a microphone, signaling a conversation rather than a lecture. Naomi and Henry sat across from each other, their differences in age and experience stark, but their mutual respect evident. Naomi began by addressing the audience. "Thank you for being here today. Many of you know I've been vocal about my beliefs, sometimes too vocal. Recent events showed me that conviction without understanding can do more harm than good. That's why we're here, to listen, to learn, and to grow." Henry shared his story in greater detail. He spoke about enlisting as a young man, believing in freedom and equality despite the reality of segregation. He recounted battles fought abroad and discrimination endured at home, painting a vivid picture of a life shaped by hope and hardship. The audience was captivated, their silence punctuated by murmurs of agreement. When Henry finished, Naomi asked, "What kept you going, even when it felt like the country you fought for didn't fight for you?" Henry smiled faintly. "Faith," he said simply, "not just in a higher power, but in people. I've seen what happens when we give in to hatred. I chose to believe change is possible, even if it's slow." The conversation continued, with audience members invited to share their own experiences. A young black veteran stood up, his voice trembling as he spoke of modern challenges. An elderly white woman shared how her father, a Yobitukuzi veteran, taught her empathy. Each story added another layer to the dialogue, weaving a tapestry of shared struggles and aspirations. By the end of the evening, the atmosphere had shifted. What began as a gathering of individuals with different perspectives transformed into a community bound by mutual respect. Naomi felt fulfilled, not from being heard but from hearing others. After the event, Naomi walked over to Henry as people began to disperse. "Thank you, Major Calloway. You've given me more than you'll ever know," she said. Henry chuckled, adjusting his coat. "You did good tonight," he replied. "This is what real change looks like. Not shouting, but sitting down and talking." As Naomi walked home under the glow of streetlights, she realized her journey was far from over. There were still battles to fight and truths to tell, but she now understood the path to justice wasn't a straight line. It was a winding road, requiring patience, humility, and a willingness to listen. For the first time, she felt ready to walk it. The ripple effects of the community event were felt long after the chairs were folded and the lights dimmed. Naomi Simmons found herself inundated with messages, some praising the event, others challenging her newfound approach. For Naomi, it was a turning point. She wasn't done growing. This was just the beginning of an unfamiliar yet rewarding journey. One email in particular caught her attention. It was from a young college student named Aisha. "Mrs. Simmons," the message began, "I watched the video of your event with Major Calloway. It made me think about my grandfather, who served in Vietnam but never talked about it. He passed away last year, and I regret not asking him more about his life. Thank you for reminding me that stories matter." Naomi read the message several times. It was a simple note, yet it resonated deeply. Stories matter. That phrase lingered in her mind as she sat at her desk, thinking about how many voices she had overlooked in her pursuit of justice. The event had opened the door to a new kind of activism, one grounded in dialogue and collective storytelling. Inspired by Aisha's message, Naomi reached out to Henry. Major Calloway, she said over the phone. I've been thinking, what if we started a project to collect stories like yours? Stories of service, sacrifice, and struggle. I think the world needs to hear them. Henry was quiet for a moment, then let out a soft chuckle. You're full of ideas, Miss Simmons, but I like this one. Let's do it. The project, which they called Voices of Valor, began as a small initiative. Naomi and Henry started interviewing veterans in their community, focusing on those whose stories had been overlooked. They recorded the conversations, turning each one into a short video series shared online. To their surprise, the project gained traction quickly. Local news outlets picked up the story, and soon veterans from across the country were reaching out, eager to share their experiences. One of the most memorable interviews was with a woman named Carmen Alvarez, a former Army nurse who served during the Gulf War. Carmen spoke about the emotional toll of caring for wounded soldiers and the challenges of returning to a society that often forgot women in uniform. People think war is just about the men who fight, she said, but there are so many of us, nurses, medics, support staff, who carry the weight of those battles long after they're over. Naomi was struck by Carmen's words. She realized how narrow her understanding of service had been, even after her encounter with Henry. The project was teaching her as much as it was teaching the audience. As the months went by, Voices of Valor became more than a platform for stories. It became a bridge between generations, races, and ideologies. Veterans who had once felt invisible found a space where their experiences were validated. Civilians who had never considered the complexities of military service began to see it in a new light. But the project wasn't without its challenges. Naomi faced criticism from some of her earlier supporters, who accused her of softening her stance against militarism. You're legitimizing the very system you used to fight against, one commenter wrote. The words stung, but Naomi stood firm. I'm not legitimizing anything, she responded in an online post. I'm amplifying voices. If we want change, we need to understand the full picture, and that includes listening to those we might disagree with. Henry, ever the steady presence, reminded her to stay true to her purpose. Criticism comes with the territory, he said one afternoon as they reviewed footage. The important thing is that you know why you're doing this. One day, Naomi received a message from a young veteran named Malik who had been following the project. I've watched every video, he wrote. For the first time, I feel like my service means something. Thank you for giving us a voice. The message brought tears to Naomi's eyes. Malik's words reminded her why she had started this journey. It wasn't about changing her beliefs. It was about expanding her understanding and creating a space for others to do the same. As the project grew, so did Naomi's relationship with Henry. The two became unlikely friends, their bond rooted in mutual respect and a shared belief in the power of stories. Henry often teased Naomi about her intensity, while she admired his quiet wisdom. Together, they formed a partnership that neither of them had anticipated, but both had come to cherish. One evening, after wrapping up an interview, Naomi and Henry sat in the empty community center, sipping coffee and reflecting on the journey so far. You know, Henry said, when we first met, I never would have guessed we'd end up here. Naomi laughed. Neither would I, but I'm glad we did. Henry nodded, his expression thoughtful. There's still a lot of work to do, but what we're doing, it matters. Naomi smiled. It does. As she walked home that night, Naomi felt a sense of fulfillment she hadn't experienced in years. Voices of Valor wasn't just a project, it was a movement, one that reminded her of the power of connection, empathy, and understanding. And as the city lights glimmered around her, she knew that this was only the beginning. The success of Voices of Valor brought unexpected challenges. As the project grew, so did the weight of responsibility. Naomi Simmons found herself juggling countless interviews, editing sessions, and public appearances. The demand for the project was overwhelming, but so was the criticism. Each new story sparked a wave of emotions: admiration, anger, sorrow, and for Naomi, the balancing act between honoring these voices and addressing her own beliefs was becoming increasingly difficult. One morning, Naomi sat at her desk with a cup of coffee, scrolling through the comments on the latest video. It was an interview with Malik, the young veteran who had reached out to her weeks earlier. In the video, Malik spoke candidly about his struggles with PTSD and the stigma surrounding mental health in the military. The response was powerful. Thousands of viewers praised Malik's courage, and many shared their own experiences. But among the support, there were also harsh critiques. "You're glorifying war," one commenter wrote. Another said, "Why not focus on the victims of these conflicts instead of the perpetrators?" Naomi stared at the screen, feeling the familiar sting of doubt. Was she betraying her principles by amplifying these stories? Or was this criticism simply the price of pursuing a deeper understanding? She picked up her phone and called Henry. "Major Calloway," she began, her voice tired. "How do you deal with it? The backlash, the criticism, how do you not let it get to you?" Henry's laugh was soft but reassuring. "I've had a lifetime of practice, Miss Simmons, but here's the thing. You're not going to please everyone. If you're doing this for approval, you're in the wrong line of work. Remember why you started." Naomi sighed. "To amplify voices, to create understanding." "Exactly," Henry said. "Stay true to that, and the rest will sort itself out." Taking Henry's advice to heart, Naomi threw herself back into the work. But this time, she approached it differently. She began involving the veterans more deeply in the production process, giving them control over how their stories were presented. It was a small change, but it made a big difference. The veterans felt empowered, and Naomi found a renewed sense of purpose. One day, Naomi and Henry were invited to speak at a national conference on storytelling and social justice. It was their biggest platform yet, and Naomi was both excited and nervous. The conference hall was packed, the audience a mix of activists, academics, and veterans. Naomi and Henry took the stage together, their contrasting styles, her fiery passion and his steady wisdom, creating a dynamic that captivated the room. Naomi began the presentation. "When we started Voices of Valor, I thought I was creating something to educate others. But the truth is, this project has educated me. It's shown me that understanding doesn't mean compromising your beliefs. It means expanding them. It means recognizing that people are more than the roles they play, that every story has layers." Henry picked up where she left off. "For me, this project has been a reminder of why I served in the first place. It wasn't about medals or recognition. It was about protecting the people I cared about. And now, through these stories, I get to keep serving in a different way." The audience erupted into applause, and for a moment, Naomi felt a deep sense of pride, not in herself, but in what they had created together. But the work wasn't done. After the conference, Naomi and Henry were approached by a woman named Evelyn, whose father had been a Korean War veteran. "My father passed away last year," Evelyn said, tears in her eyes. "He never talked about his service, but I know it shaped him. Thank you for giving people like him a voice, even if they're no longer here to tell their stories." Evelyn's words stayed with Naomi as she and Henry continued their work. They began reaching out to families of veterans who had passed away, collecting memories and letters to add another dimension to the project. The stories became more complex, more nuanced, and Naomi realized that Voices of Valor was no longer just about veterans. It was about communities, families, and the ripple effects of service and sacrifice. One evening, as they wrapped up an interview with an elderly veteran named Mr. Jenkins, Henry turned to Naomi. "You know, when you first called me to apologize, I thought it was a one-time thing. I never imagined we'd be here." Naomi laughed. "Neither did I. But I'm glad we are." Henry smiled. "Me too. You've got fire, Miss Simmons, and that's a good thing. Just don't let it burn you out." As Naomi walked home that night, she thought about Henry's words. The work was exhausting, but it was worth it. Every story they told was a step toward understanding, toward bridging divides that seemed impossible to cross. And as she looked up at the stars, she felt a quiet determination. There was still so much to do, but for the first time in her life, she felt like she was exactly where she was meant to be. The culmination of Voices of Valor was something Naomi Simmons and Major Henry Calloway had never imagined. What began as a small project in their community blossomed into a national movement, bridging divides once thought impossible. Veterans and civilians alike joined together, sharing stories, challenging perspectives, and fostering empathy. One day, Naomi received an invitation from a prestigious national award committee, recognizing Voices of Valor for its impact on storytelling and social justice. The ceremony was to be held in Washington, D.C., and both Naomi and Henry were invited. Naomi hesitated as she read the email, unsure of how she felt about such recognition. It was Henry's voice that convinced her to accept. "Ms. Simmons," Henry said, "this isn't about us. This is about the stories we've shared. This is their moment." The night of the ceremony was surreal. Naomi and Henry sat among changemakers from across the country. When their project was announced as the winner, Naomi's heart raced as they walked to the stage. The applause was deafening, but all Naomi could think about were the faces of the veterans who had trusted them. Henry took the microphone first. "This project started with a conversation," he began. "A difficult one. But that conversation led to understanding, and that understanding led to this. The stories we've shared aren't just about war or service, they're about humanity, and it's my hope this work continues to remind us all of the power of listening." Naomi stepped up next, her hands trembling. "When we started Voices of Valor, I thought I knew what activism was. But this journey has taught me justice is messy, and understanding is complicated. The stories we've shared have changed me in ways I can't fully articulate. To every veteran and family who trusted us with their truths, this is for you." The standing ovation that followed felt like a culmination of everything they had worked for, yet Naomi knew it wasn't an ending. It was another beginning. After the ceremony, Naomi and Henry sat on the venue steps. "We did it," Naomi said, her voice a mix of exhaustion and pride. Henry chuckled. "We did something, that's for sure. But there's always more to do." The stories they shared unearthed wounds that needed tending. Naomi and Henry partnered with mental health organizations, ensuring veterans had access to support. One collaboration created a Voices of Valor Fund, offering counseling for veterans and families. Naomi couldn't have imagined such partnerships when she first met Henry in the park. Another unexpected avenue emerged when schools and universities began incorporating Voices of Valor into their curriculums. Educators used the stories to teach students about the complexities of war, service, and sacrifice. Naomi found herself speaking to classrooms filled with eager young faces, their curiosity reminding her why the project mattered. The goal wasn't to glorify or condemn. It was to educate, to inspire empathy and understanding. One of Naomi's most memorable moments came during a classroom visit. A young student raised his hand and asked, "Ms. Simmons, do you think stories like these can really change the world?" Naomi smiled, pausing before replying, "I think stories change how we see the world, and when we change how we see, we change how we act. That's the power of stories. They inspire us to be better." As the years went by, Naomi and Henry's bond deepened. They often joked about their unlikely partnership. "If someone told me a few years ago I'd be working with Major Henry Calloway," Naomi said one afternoon over coffee, "I'd have laughed them out of the room." "And if someone told me I'd be teaming up with Naomi Simmons," Henry replied, grinning, "I'd have assumed I was dreaming." Their friendship became a symbol of the project itself, a testament to what could happen when two people with different perspectives pursued a common goal. One day, Naomi received a letter from a high school student named Marcus. "I watched one of your videos in class," the letter began. "It was the one about the nurse from the Gulf War. It made me think about my grandmother, who worked as a medic. I asked her about it, and she told me stories I never knew. Thank you for helping me see her in a new light." Naomi kept that letter on her desk, a reminder of why they did what they did. The project wasn't just about veterans. It was about everyone touched by their stories. It was about connection, healing, and understanding. Years later, at the 10th anniversary of Voices of Valor, Naomi and Henry stood together at a commemorative event. The room was filled with veterans, families, and supporters who had been part of the journey. As they watched a montage of stories play on the screen, Henry leaned over. "Look at what you started," he said softly. Naomi shook her head, her eyes misty. "We started this. Together." As the montage ended and the crowd erupted in applause, Naomi felt overwhelming gratitude. The road had been long and winding, but worth every step. She looked at Henry, at the faces in the crowd, and at the screen where the stories continued to play. This was justice. This was humanity at its best. And Naomi knew without a doubt they had only just begun.